All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our free webinar today, where we're going to be addressing a challenging and thought-provoking and I think even fear-based topic that addresses this whole concern of bombs or backpacks responding to the emerging threat of explosives in churches. Uh, Thank you for joining us today, carving out your time. For those of you who are participating live in the webinar, we're grateful to have you. For those of you who are going to be listening to this webinar as a recording, um, please feel free to share this with your teams, your leadership, because this is information we want to make sure we get out there. Just for quick introductions, my name is Craig Cable. I'm going to be your host today. I'm the Church Safety and Security Director here at Group Publishing. I'm also a Reserve Deputy for the Larimer County Sheriff's Office, and I'm a co-leader of an armed church security team here in Northern Colorado, as well as I provide security consulting and training for other churches all around the country. It's a pleasure to be able to host our webinar today. I have a special guest. Thrilled to have Sergeant Ryan Ertman join us. Sergeant Ertman has been a member of law enforcement for 17 years with both Colorado State Patrol and the Loveland Police Department, and he's a member of the Northern Colorado Bomb Squad for 9 years, and he's actually the squad commander, has been so for 6 years. Welcome, Sergeant Ertman. It's a pleasure to have you.
It's a pleasure to be here, Craig. Thank you.
You bet. Well, thanks for joining us. Our agency here, our bomb squad in Northern Colorado, is maybe different than other agencies in that these are collectives of agencies that represent Sheriff's Office, which I'm a part of, Fort Collins Police Department, Loveland PD. Is that fairly common that you have kind of interagency partnerships with bomb squads?
It has been, and our particular area is unique, especially considering the size. We're not as big and as condensed as, so, Denver and Aurora that can often have their own squads, and also we don't have as much money. So, but with the amount of people that we still have in the area, we still have a need. So, we've all the agencies have collectively realized that, and they all contribute equally to the squad and helping give personnel training time, money for equipment and resources, and just allowing us to do these jobs on a collateral basis, which is just meaning we all have other duties and responsibilities, and then we do the bomb squad on the side.
In addition to
And
that, gotcha.
yeah, in addition.
Well, I know I've had the privilege of working on a few events and got a chance to work with some of your folks, and it's just I love that we're doing this interagency, that we all the teams are working together, because in a crisis, if we're responding to it, it's good to know that everyone is operating from the same page. It's awesome. Um, you're gonna, folks, we want this to be an interactive webinar. And so if you have questions that you came into the webinar that you wanna make sure we cover, please use the Q&A button that's up in your dashboard and pose that question. Just make sure that we cover it. If there's something that either myself or Sergeant Ertman share in the presentation that you want further clarification or have a question around it, please use it for that as well. We want this to be interactive. We're gonna try our best to field as many questions through the webinar as time will allow. And then if there's any real burning questions that were a common question, we can even respond after the webinar just to those individuals that we weren't able to get to. But please take advantage of the Q&A button to pose that question. We have folks standing by who are going to be collecting those. Well, you talked a little bit about the interagency relationships for the bomb squad, but you guys have some unique missions as well. And there's on your screen are some of the responsibilities. Sergeant Ertman, can you kind of walk us through a little bit about what is the role and what do you do as a member of the bomb squad?
So we're basically the guys who touch things that nobody else wants to touch, and that's kind of goes in a lot of different areas, in the sense of recovery is a big part of what we do, where somebody runs into is some old ammunition or some old ordnance, military ordnance, chemicals that have been sitting around for long periods of time, anything that could have changed or could have potentially be dangerous now, they will often call us. And so when everybody's calling their supervisors and they're calling their bosses about, what do we do with this, what do we do with this, if it keeps going up the chain, it usually ends up with us. So we'll deal with any sort of recoveries, we'll deal with any sort of devices that were intentionally made that of course no one wants to mess with. We can transport those, we can dispose of them, we can countercharge them. Render safe is how we refer to that, which basically means we take away the danger associated with the device. And just we even do regular disposal operations where we get rid of ammunition and fireworks, and fireworks are actually incredibly dangerous, but they're obviously illegal, or most of them are illegal in the area. So we'll get rid of those too, and not it's not as fun as everybody thinks. We don't get to function them as they're designed. We have to just blow 'em, burn them all up and make a lot of noise and smoke. But it's ultimately a pretty good gig, and it's a lot of variety with it.
That's awesome. Well, I notice here on the last point here is you develop bomb threat awareness and safety programs for public and private organizations. And quite frankly, that's why you're joining us here today. This is part of the mission, is to serve the community and houses of worship by being a resource for information, potentially training. And I think that's how you and I even actually first met. Was I invited you to come to speak to our church group around what are some considerations with regards to IEDs, and you were just a wealth of information, and so I wanted to make sure I invited you back for a webinar. But tell me a little bit about, what does that look like? How would someone go about connecting with their local agency in that capacity?
Well, especially up in this area, the good news is that everybody's paying attention to it. So we don't have to have some of these big horrific events for our agencies and our leadership to address the fact that this is real, and this could come to our area just as easily as it's been to any other area. So obviously, as part of our mission at the Loveland Police Department and of the agencies that we're involved in, is we want communities to be prepared for it. The moment you think about it, the moment you're training for it, the moment you're ready for it, even as a citizen, as a somebody working security in a church, or as a law enforcement officer, the moment you've thought about it and prepared for it, it's not going to be overwhelming if and when the incident occurs, and you're ready for it, and you can act as needed. So it is a very important mission of ours to help provide that education and to let people know that it's real. Sometimes we go to places and just have to say, hey, did you know that bombs can be made, and bombs are very dangerous, and bombs are real? And that is enough to open their eyes to the potential of paying attention to security concerns and threats, and people in their building that shouldn't be, and things around their building that shouldn't be.
Well, that's great. Well, we sure appreciate you dedicating so much time and effort just to keep the public informed and safe. So thank you for all the work that you do there. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the context, of is this a real threat? Are there incidents happening? And I just grabbed a few that were literally within just the last few weeks, couple months out. This is one that really wasn't public knowledge, really wasn't widely circulated because it was a thwarted attack. But this individual, Syrian refugee, Mustafa Mousab Alowemer, I'm going to probably butcher that last name, was arrested by the FBI for allegedly plotting and preparing to blow up a church in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, using an explosives-filled backpack. He was going through the whole planning stage. He was the preparing stage and was in the process of trying to purchase the actual explosives from an undercover FBI agent, thank goodness. But this was not a high-profile church. It was actually a very small church, and I believe his attempt was probably just to see if he could do it. What was involved? What would be some of the considerations and planning? Do you see that sometimes, Sergeant Ertman, that sometimes these kind of smaller, low-level attacks are dry runs, so to speak?
Oh, absolutely. And any good operation, as we've been in law enforcement, and you've got things that have to be done on our side, all require preparation and planning, and require a little bit of research and some time and attention. And the good news is that it does successful attempts require that attention, and we can catch them during those attempts rather than waiting until they're actually purchasing explosives or actually walking into the church with something on their back. So it is those are the best times for us to be able to catch them, and for you guys to be able to catch them, is when they're just doing weird things and it's inconsistent with what in your community, in your area, in your church. So
Yeah.
it is a very, very, very good time to deal with that.
Well, if his hope was, if he can affect this and was successful in this bombing, that his goal was to inspire others to do similar attacks, which is terrifying to think that that the motivation was to drive other people to do something similar. This was also This is very recent, August 14th. The FBI arrested Connor Klimo for allegedly planning to attack the the Lev Hashim Messianic Synagogue using Molotov cocktails and improvised explosive devices. He was in the process of building those devices, and once again, through the investigative work, some suspicious behaviors, they were able to catch him before he actually, the incident, so lives were saved. And he had a whole list of people he was planning to attack, but this is someone, actually, if I remember correctly, had even some security background. He had a little bit of some training and some understanding of how security systems and security measures were going to be, and was going to use that in some of his planning. So that's pretty terrifying that that folks are kind of working behind the scenes with that goal.
Yeah,
Here,
it was interesting to me to find out that not only, like you said earlier, they're not only doing this just to create damage and create, chaos and hurt people. They're doing it for inspiration. So it seems like a very major thing just to get others inspired, and the others are being inspired, and they say so after the fact when these big events occur, and they find out they were inspired by these type of earlier events. So it is very scary and it's very real.
boy, isn't that the truth? Here's another incident, and there's actually been several. This is just one of several that I found. August 4th, Indiana Police Bomb Squad investigated a suspicious package containing a potential incendiary device that was left on a refrigerator within Zionsville Presbyterian Church. What's interesting is this device was constructed to look like a device. I mean, it was like a unattended diaper bag. It had a cell phone in it, had wires in it, it had wrapping in this package, and it was designed to look, there was a foreign liquid in a jar. It was intended to look like some type of incendiary device. I found some other news stories where um, kind of simulated bombs with wires and timers, and the whole system was a functioning device. The only thing absent was the actual explosive. Why do you think they're doing this? What's some of the logic in creating hoax devices?
I think there's a couple things. The first thing that goes to my mind is they're testing our response, testing the response of the place where they put this, and just and watching. And they could be sitting off on the side, minding their business, looking like someone not just reading the newspaper type of thing, and watching how the people inside work, and how they handle the situation. Do they have everybody evacuate? Do they not? Is it chaos? Is it controlled? And then obviously when the police show up, where does everybody park? What are they doing? I mean, there's all those things we as officers are thinking about, and how they're preparing for that with these devices. And
Wow.
then of course there's also the potential that they're just trying to create some chaos, and they're just trying to scare people, and make people react, and and see how that works out too. It's hard to tell what they're doing, because some people, they make that and they actually think it's going to do something, and they just may not understand that they have to have a better system in place. I don't know, but it is certainly scary, because that's well above just thinking about it or talking about it or reading about it. It's actually going out and carrying something through.
Wow. Yeah, that you're right. And you think, wow, they're building all this because they're probing to see what our response is. That's even maybe more terrifying, because they obviously have something much larger in mind. And as first responders, we're always cognizant of not running into a situation, taking an assessment of the situation for that very reason, right? Well, let's
Right.
talk a little bit about some of the trends in terrorism. We're talking a little bit about these devices, but there's kind of a broader view. And I thought this was an interesting quote. This was from Michael McGarity. He's the Assistant Director of the Counterterrorism Division of the FBI. And this is a quote: "The threat posed to the United States has expanded from sophisticated, externally directed plots to include individual attacks carried out by what we're now calling homegrown violent extremists." You may see that referred to as HVSs, who are inspired by foreign terrorist organizations, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, to take action within the United States. What they're now seeing is similar insular self-radicalized actors in the domestic terrorism realm. And we'll talk a little bit about the difference between international terrorism and domestic terrorism. And there are some slight nuances to them. For definition's sake, international terrorism is perpetrated by individuals and or groups inspired by or associated with designated foreign terrorist or organizations or nations. And typically that's state sponsored. That's where you're most familiar with Al-Qaeda, ISIS, ISIL, etc. Then you have what's called domestic terrorism, and these are perpetrated by individuals or groups inspired by or associated with primarily US-based movements that espouse extremist ideologies of a political, religious, social, racial, or environmental nature. Now, sometimes some groups that you may have become familiar with is Antifa, the KKK. Some would even say Black Lives Matter is potentially some. A lot of different domestic groups are now being sort of labeled or considered as HVEs. And that while they may have a radicalized ideology built around those common political, religious, social, racial motivations, Ryan, I think you and I are both seeing that there's a whole other group that are operating without a clear understanding, or they have a mental break where there's maybe some mental illness, and that's actually driving their motivations. Is that safe to say?
Absolutely, and like you said, when people ask me what the largest type of calls that I respond to on a daily basis, or what takes up the majority of my time, I automatically, without even any thought, have to say mental health. The mental health system is there's lots of gaps in there. There's lots of weaknesses. There's lots of places for people to slip through and be able to go about their daily lives in a mental state that is not healthy for them, not healthy for their neighbors, for any of us, and for law enforcement. So it is a huge part of that. And now once you access, you take all of the information you can get online, all of the negative information you can find, all of the extreme information you can find, and then you add that to the mental health, and it just stacks one on top of the other. And then, sometimes crazy things happen, or people do crazy things, and that's where I feel like it's a huge part of what we're dealing with.
You bet. I had the opportunity to speak at a big safety summit, safety and faith summit, and one of the other presenters was an FBI director. And the FBI director described that fantasy oftentimes drive this mental illness, coupled with this kind of fantasy around striking fear, power, creating chaos, all of those things. So yeah, if there's someone who's not deeply rooted in some form of reality, and then they see these other groups and they're now trying to mimic those other groups, that's a recipe for disaster.
Absolutely.
Well, let's talk a little bit about, we've been using the terminology IED, and that essentially stands for improvised explosive device, and it's a homemade bomb and or destructive device used to destroy, incapacitate, harass, or distract. And I think when people think about IEDs, they typically think through what they saw in the news in Afghanistan, Iraq, roadside IEDs. But the truth is they come in a variety of different forms, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But they have some key components that are typically involved in some type of explosive device. And this is not all inclusive, right? There's other things, but the main are some type of initiator, some switch, some type of charge or explosive, or some element that's the more volatile component, some type of power source. It sits in some type of container, and then some are just intended to be explosive. Some are intended to be fragmented with nails, glass, a lot of different things that they use for shrapnel. But boy, I think what's terrifying to me is that not only are these materials fairly available, but there's a lot of online instruction manuals on how to create, homemade devices. So a question for you, Sergeant Ertman, is how readily available are the instructions and the materials, and can anyone with very little training successfully create a device that would hurt people?
Absolutely, and that's where we start talking about some of the mental health component, where maybe these people in an original setting wouldn't necessarily go to this level, but you start adding the internet and the availability of the chemicals and the instruction, and now all of a sudden you've combined somebody who's incredibly unstable with something that's incredibly dangerous. And these devices go they run the gamut from incredibly rudimentary, basic, Walmart type devices where they're just going to be, they're maybe just some sort of fireworks or some sort of match heads or whatever, and then all the way up to incredibly difficult and complex devices. And it's all based on, excuse me, it's all based on the availability of resources, the experience of the builder, the time that they have, the willingness that they have. You see a lot of different things that are based mainly out of what people have in their garage, rather than even something that they have to go to the store and buy. So there's so many different things that they can make, and they can look so many different ways that it's something you can't just say, okay, if you see this that looks like this, then that's a bomb. You have to look at it and go, does this look weird? Is this suspicious? Should I be paying more attention to this than normal? And because you may have this one idea of what an IED is, and then all of a sudden somebody comes in and makes something completely different.
And it doesn't fit the mold. Well,
Absolutely.
let's talk a little bit about that. I've got a handy chart, and this was courtesy of Department of Homeland Security. I thought this was really informative because it gives you the whole spectrum of small package explosive IED to all the way up to large vehicle-borne explosive devices. So maybe you can kind of just run us through a little bit. What do you see as far as that you've seen that's more common? What's kind of in the realm of that an amateur could probably create, and the availability of to acquire explosives at that size versus another size? Maybe kind of run us through a quick tour of what are we looking at when we see a chart like this?
So I like to consider complexity and time in as you move up through that. I mean, it's very, very easy to put together a pipe bomb. It's very simple. One can do it in a day, and it looks like a pipe bomb. Everybody knows what it looks like. Everybody's seen it, and nobody questions you when you go into the store, when you go to the Home Depot and buy yourself some pipe with some end caps. So it is a it's just a matter of what you want to do. Now, if you want to turn a whole car into a bomb, all of a sudden that requires a lot more time, a lot more practice, and a better device, because there's a lot at stake there. So, but I also like to talk about with this time, distance, and shielding. We use that in our profession when we're trained to let you know exactly where you can be with that device. And of course, the smaller the device, the better, because that means you can be a little bit closer to it, and maybe end up being okay if it does go off. But then if you're anywhere within easy 300 feet of a car bomb, you're going to be dead regardless of wearing a bomb suit or not.
Right.
So one thing I like to explain to people when we're talking about suspicious items is that if you're in a building and you have a backpack and it's in, say, your main church area, and you have a very large church with lots of other hallways and rooms and such, then if you're not in that room, or maybe directly outside of that room, if something happened where that went off, you're going to have some structural damage. You're going to have you're going to get rattled a little bit, but you're probably going to be okay. And again, it depends on what type of explosive it is, and all that sort of, what kind of frag and all that. But it basically, for what we're talking about, a smaller device means you probably don't have to completely evacuate the city. You can evacuate the area, you can evacuate maybe even the building, and you're going to be okay if something does happen. So we use the concept of time. Obviously, if it's like a time device and you have an hour, you have plenty of time to get everybody out of there, and so that you can evacuate the area in a manner that if that is a timer and it goes all the way down, then you're good. Or you have the distance because if you were far enough away, or you were able to get everybody far enough away. Or the shielding, you had something in between you and the suspected device that can protect you, or at least provide less damage to you and anyone around, just because of that shield.
Hmm. No, I think that's something that surprises most people, is that something that's like a letter bomb or a pipe bomb, to your point, it's fairly isolated. I had an opportunity when I was in the service to work with some of our explosive ordnance teams in the Air Force, and it surprised me actually how directional that is. that it's not like it's going to level the building something that size. To your point, it's some property damage, but just being cognizant of, okay, how do we, what's a reasonable response? And we're going to talk a little bit now about some of what is a, how do you detect that, what's suspicious? And you've alluded to, hey, that's kind of a key component of this. If we can see a suspicious device or suspicious behaviors, and we believe that there's something here, what do we do next? So let's dive into that a little bit. I think we hear this in law enforcement. You see this through the TSA. It takes some pretty specialized bomb detection technologies, and I've had an opportunity to see how our Northern Colorado Bomb Squad, some of the technologies they use with the robots and some of that. It's fascinating, but for the average untrained person, it is hard to maybe detect, what type of device that is. So I think let's focus on the best defense is just to be alert for suspicious behaviors and IED indicators. This is where I'd like to spend a good bulk of this time together. What are some of those IED indicators, and what type of behaviors would catch your attention?
So the first thing that comes to mind is when you're talking to people who are used to being in that area. They're used to working there. They're used to having services there. That's their job. And what I love is that the churches and businesses and smaller communities within our community, they're creating some security and some people whose job it is to pay attention to suspicious behavior. It only takes time, a couple of shifts, for people to realize what's normal for their community, for their parish, for their church, for their business, whatever. They can decide, and they can understand uh, what to be expected. If there's certain people who come in and need certain backpacks, or some kid always has the backpack and just always lays it down in a particular area, those are the people that we seek out first when we're called to a suspicious package. Is who knows this area, who's familiar with the people, who's familiar with a day-to-day activity. Because if you want to ask a bomb tech what's a bomb, everything's a bomb. And so nobody wants to shut their business down for a time for us to go through and evaluate everything that could be a bomb.
Hmm.
So we will often seek out that knowledge and that skill base from you guys, from those who are familiar with it, to say what is weird. Why was this certain circumstance weird? Sometimes we can explain it. Well, they don't normally come to this area. They were visiting with some family, and they were just a new person from a different country or from a different state, and so we didn't recognize this, and definitely were not aware of what was happening. So it's that type of just what's different is the best way that I can explain and how to better help the law enforcement and specifically the bomb squad.
Well, can I give you an example? This is something we ran into during a service. We had an individual come in. We hadn't seen him before. He came into the lobby wearing sunglasses. That's suspicious. It's bright inside. That's odd that he's wearing sunglasses. He didn't just walk straight in. He kind of hovered to the peripheral. He took inventory of who was in the room. He looked like he was looking up at the ceilings, maybe to see where the camera was. He had a black backpack with him. It looked like it was a fairly sizable backpack. He then made his way into, he didn't grab coffee or interact with anyone, just walked into the sanctuary, walked over to an area where some families were sitting, sat down, laid his backpack down, and then within just a matter of a couple minutes, never took off his sunglasses, got up, walked out without acknowledging his backpack, and started heading out the door. He didn't make it all the way out of the building, but left his backpack was there. Now, I'm not an expert, but to me that was about a 10 on the suspicious scale.
Yeah, I would call that an easy 10.
Okay. What are some things that, just in that quick little narrative, what are some things that people, you already hit on a few of them. What were some things about that narrative that made that suspicious?
Well, the most important thing I think of right away is when you start that story, and when this thing is quickly evolving, none of that is in any point in time when law enforcement would be expected or even respond if you called us.
Right.
That's the stuff for you first responders, and literally first responders, those people who are there to watch over your community. Those first responders and those people paying attention are the ones that are going to have to start making assessments of that. And because right now you put together a 10, right? You put together this thing, but you say, well, I've got a guy comes in, he's wearing a black backpack and he's got sunglasses on, and that's not suspicious. But you have what we consider in law enforcement the totality of the circumstances that make that suspicious. And then you have to make that decision amongst yourself and amongst your procedures to actually contact and make and try to address that concern. That could be a dry run, like we've talked about, seeing it, how attentive people are being to those things, or it could be the one. So I mean, you're just pointing out immediately things that are outside of that norm for that specific instance, and those are what we're asking people to look for. And when you give me a situation like that, if let's just say the backpack incident was never resolved, he brought a backpack in and did all that, I can tell you right now that law enforcement's going to make that and step that up into a bigger thing because of how suspicious that was.
Because of the totality of, in any one individual thing probably wasn't enough, but once again, it's the totality of the circumstances. Well,
Absolutely.
we have a question here I'd like to field, because I think this is going to be very common with other questions. We talked about a backpack, but we also have suspicious vehicles that have been left in our parking lot or left unattended there. And so I'm going to just read this question verbatim, and we want to make sure, I'd love your thoughts on this. So what are your recommendations for churches when an unidentified, unattended vehicle is parked in the lot outside of typical service times? Will the local police respond, or are there certain conditions that must be met before they will respond and check out the vehicle, such as running the license plate? I have some thoughts on that, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, it's a great question, and it's kind of right there on that in that gray area, right? If you just called 911 and said that those facts in and of themselves, we wouldn't respond, or if we did, it would probably be pretty late because it'd be a low priority call. So somebody has to be the one to go up there, and we use that obviously in our sense. It's the first patrol officer who gets assigned that call, and so if you don't have immediate red flags that are saying that this vehicle should not be approached, those are going to be very obvious red flags. But if it's just that type of a scenario where it's an odd vehicle, somebody has to go up to that vehicle and start assessing it, getting a plate number, maybe taking, just, I don't want to say take photos because sometimes that's inside people's stuff, but if it's really weird, take a photo of just how the vehicle is positioned, or maybe even the plate or something that you can reference later, so that you don't necessarily have to go back up if the situation does become suspicious. But there's a point where you got to go up there and take a look at the vehicle and see, why is it suspicious? Is there anything else in there that's giving you any indicators? And with that, we can make a little bit better information or better decisions based on that information to handle it.
Yeah, this would be a good, so in my mind, if I received that call and was responding on patrol, it would be, well, that's private property. If you want the vehicle towed, call to have it towed. That'd be one thing. That's different than, hey, there's a vehicle sitting, there's like 4 propane tanks in the back that appear to be wired together. That's a different situation.
Oh, way
Or,
different.
so obviously that's an extreme. But I think the point I think you're making is that whether it be a backpack or a vehicle, there is still some investigative work that has to happen to be able to tie together the totality of the circumstances that would warrant a law enforcement response. Just unto itself, unattended vehicle may not be. Its parking, its proximity, what's inside it. A threat, maybe there'd been a call. That would be another chain of events that would say, hey, someone called and said that they didn't like what our church, the pastor had said about a particular political view, and he was going to take care of it. Next thing you know, there's this unattended vehicle that's sitting by our front door. You can kind of see that's an escalation of, okay, that's another piece of the puzzle that in totality may warrant a different type of response.
And that work never ends. And I always tell my officers, once they get to a call and they start working this suspicious instance, or they're starting to get some information and take some information from everybody, then they once they even get to the point where they're calling the bomb squad, they still have to keep working that problem. They have to continue to check cameras and continue to talk to people. There's been times where even the mere police presence around a specific item has gotten the attention of the person who actually left it there, and we would have never have found them. And they came up and they said, "Hey, what's going on? Why are you all around this wrapped up item?" And they said, "Well, because it was suspicious." "Oh, it's one of these." And then we were able to quickly confirm that, and the bomb squad got called off. So it's that type of work has to continue to go on even while police are en route, or even while the bomb squad is en route, because otherwise everything's gonna stop and stagnate. More information helps us make better decisions.
Yeah, so as a church security team, we've identified something. Now's the time where we're doing the due diligence to go through the building. Did anyone see someone leave that? Let's take a look at the cameras. Has there been other things left before? That's fantastic intel, right? When you show up, that we
Absolutely.
can paint that whole picture for you. Here's what we saw, because I could just see someone running up and going, "Why did you just blow up the pastor's fruitcake that I got him for Christmas?" It's start asking around, try to see if you can pull as much information as you can. Well, Sergeant Ertman, when we were promoting this webinar, I would say the most common thing a response that I got from people who were interested in the webinar was, well, backpacks are ubiquitous. Every high school kid, junior high kid carries a backpack, and it may surprise most people, anyone who's ever had teenagers, they may not be the most responsible. And so leaving backpacks around the church is a daily occurrence. And so let's talk a little bit we're going to segue now into that whole, what makes a suspicious package? What are some suspicious behaviors that would elevate that to a degree? We've talked a little bit about it, but my hope is people don't get out of this webinar and just going, there's nothing we can do because darn backpacks and diaper bags are so common. The other thing I want to make sure I highlight is that whatever your policy is when it comes to bags, that there is a precedence that churches are inadvertently or very intentionally targeting or profiling certain types of individuals, race, socioeconomic status, that they are hyper targeting them without any real, and what we call in law enforcement, probable cause. We are held to a standard of you have to have probable cause to make contact. I would say there's a similar standard in security if you want to avoid some type of lawsuit for being unfairly targeted based on race or variety of other things. So let's talk a little bit about this whole suspicious package and what are some common sense approaches for that.
Yeah, as much as I'd love to have all these suspicious calls of various backpack being left around, that would probably get me a full-time team. It's not going to be necessarily the best use of everybody's time.
Right. Well, we have up on your screen here some of the considerations that you gave me as some things. Maybe we can kind of walk through that, and maybe you can elaborate on each one of these points.
So, you know, when we talk about what's suspicious, I continue to go back to what's normal for the area and what's abnormal for the area. There's no way for me to possibly give all the potential uh, ways that something could be suspicious, because the more somebody knows about an area, the more easy it is to make it look like it fits in. So it's a very difficult topic that is completely um, based on the environment. But some of the things that we're looking for specifically is, what is the area? Is it an area that is a targeted area? Now, churches, obviously, as we've just discussed throughout the rest of this, is that it is a target. Churches are a soft target, and they're a place that people find. You probably don't have a lot of armed people, or if you do, maybe you have a few. You can easily get your numbers up higher as far as your victims and your injuries and deaths. And so, I mean, it's a very big target. So you have to pay attention to that. Is If it's in a church, I'm going to pay a little bit more attention. If it's in a field that nobody's in, then it becomes a little less suspicious, or a little less more likely that it's a device. Again, is it abnormal for it to be there? If it's in a school, yeah, you're going to have backpacks everywhere. You can't call every backpack in. If it's in a church, you're going to have the diaper bags everywhere. So those things are not going to start to level me up in the sense of of being suspicious. Then again, it comes back to the work. So you've determined it doesn't belong there just because of the work you've already done, or that it is a targeted area, and that it's not an item commonly left there. So now you have to start coming up with some answers. How did it get there? And as those answers, those questions start being answered, then you start to uh, have more on that scale to judge how suspicious that is. And it doesn't take very much work for it. It takes asking a few people. It takes a little bit of review of the camera, or just some more observation to see if anybody comes back to it, or if anybody's watching it, or keeping an eye. So there's little things that you can do in a very short period of time that are going to give you more information to determine whether it's just unattended or suspicious. When you get into, well, now you've determined, well, you don't have any more information, you don't have any camera, nobody knows anything about it. Well, now you're going to have to take a look at it. You're going to get an idea about what it is. How big is it? If you do have to evacuate, what are the areas and distances that you're probably going to have to evacuate with? And then also, what's happening in the bag? Is it making any noises? Does it have any odd sounds or smells, or just look like it's seeping anything, oils, um, making any noises. Wires obviously are a pretty big indicator. Now that doesn't mean if you have a charging cord inside of it or coming out of it, not necessarily quite the same. But if you have some more electrical wires in there, then it starts to ramp up into the area of being suspicious. And at that point, if you don't have any of those things, those obvious things, those things that you see on the internet, or you see as just those real big red flags, there might be a need to try and either get it out of the area, or open it, or look at it. However your procedures and protocol tell you to do, there's going to be a point where somebody has to figure it out if it's not quite suspicious yet. Sometimes that's an officer, sometimes that's one of your security members. It just depends on whose job that is to check that out.
So if there was something highly suspicious, it wouldn't be recommended, like, for example, wires seeping, smells, ticking, probably not a good idea to open it. But if it's
Correct.
a diaper bag that has two half-used bottles on it, it may be reasonable, because of the lack of the totality of other extenuating circumstances, it may be reasonable to look, just quickly look in it. Is that safe?
Absolutely. And
Okay.
the difference is, do you touch it or don't you? And that's where, when you start doing all these trainings, and this is I love the fact that you're doing this and you're getting this out to so many people, because this is training, and this is training for people to have in their minds of going on with what they're looking for, what they're seeing, what they're hearing, what they're studying online, what they're getting in newsletters, and any sort of training materials. And so they can make that determination and say, what is it that is making it to the point you don't want to touch it. And once you don't want to touch it, okay, that's great. Then all you have to do is everything away from that, and take care of your people, take care of your community, and get them to a safe location, and let people like myself, or even officers that respond initially, let them deal with it. And that's what we want to do. Like you said, when there's none of those red flags and none of those things that tell you it's suspicious, somebody's going to have to deal with it, touch it, move it, maybe. So we ask that people just do so delicately. You don't want to just grab it, dump it, open it aggressively and dump it out on the floor. Because what if it is suspicious? What if it is well hidden? And that's part of what they did in their work, is made that very, very good, very protected device, in the sense of it just looks pretty normal. So you don't want to just go in and start throwing things around and moving stuff, because that could initiate a device.
Yeah, no, you're right, and that takes a higher level of sophisticated device. Not your average person is going to be able to create a device with those kind of fail safes in there. But so you've now, that's a great segue into this next bullet point. If you find a suspicious package and it's now met the criteria that we've kind of previously talked about, it has some of those elements. I think what you're saying now is that this is time to call, and it really is your discretion. It sounds like it's to what degree you're comfortable with. I know as a sheriff's deputy, we have no qualms with responding. If the worst thing that happens, we respond to an unattended diaper bag and there's no action taken, that's a real easy report for me. So I hope you're hearing us not saying we're discouraging from calling. We just, the additional information and due diligence to lay out the pieces of the puzzle sure would help hit our radar screen differently, and our response would be appropriate once we have totality of the information. But I think in this first point is then, here's where you start talking to supervisors, you start letting people know, you let authorities know, and you start acting.
Yes.
And that act would be 911. And I imagine if anyone's ever sat in 911 dispatch, they're amazing for one thing, and it's going to set into a whole series of events. And then that's at that point you're going to get a page, and your team's going to get a page. They're going to be pulled off of the other duties they're on, and they're going to start responding.
Yes, and that's just it. We want to make sure that everybody understands you can call for these things. That's not, and I hope that I'm not confusing anyone by saying those two, making those two distinctions. But I do think that there's if every backpack was called in, if every diaper bag was called in, it would completely inundate what we're doing, and it would just slow down the response. So that's why having you guys, your team, your group of people that are trying to provide security for these things, they have some sort of protocol, some sort of training in place to deal with an unattended and then also a suspicious bag, then it helps make that process go faster and more efficient. And it doesn't, it's just not that one business that's always calling in something that's left there because it's normally left there.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think you've already even hit on this next point, is that then you make a decision to partial or fully evacuate depending upon the location, the device, what you perceive. And then at that point, it's do not approach, touch, or otherwise tamper with it. It has risen to the point of, we believe this is a device based on the circumstances and the evidence. And then at that point, it's you're clearing out. You're going to and you guys got some great tools to evaluate that device and take it further. But
And the
that,
good, if I may
yeah,
say, the good
sure.
news is your guys don't even have to determine that it's a device, and I don't. You have to be able to just say, hey, look, these are the reasons it's suspicious,
Yeah,
and then we're going to take it seriously from there. Nowadays, especially with the targeted area like churches, we are absolutely have to take that very seriously. And you just determine why it's suspicious. Help us with that, and then we'll deal with the fact of whether it's an IED or not.
yeah, absolutely. And we've already talked a little bit about keeping researching. The work doesn't stop there. Keep researching, because that's all the intel that law enforcement responders are going to need. And then I think this last point is really important, is that trust your instincts. If it doesn't look right, feel right, then trust that. And then I think we see this all the time, is that you assume someone else is going to take responsibility or going to report it. And you be that one. We even talk about that in law enforcement when we're responding to a situation. If there's not a leader, you lead. And I think that, to me, personifies that. If it doesn't feel right, act on your instincts, and then and report it.
Absolutely. We refer to that as the leadership void. And somebody has to fill the leadership void when somebody can't be there.
Yeah.
So that's a great point.
Well, we've covered a lot. We've just got a couple more minutes left. If someone has a burning question that we've either hit on or would like to elaborate a little, would like for us to elaborate a little further, feel free to post that question. We got just a couple more minutes. We can field a couple more questions. Here's one that I'm going to just give a public service announcement as you hopefully you're typing your questions out, is that I mentioned before about the concerns over lawsuits for potentially profiling. And I'll give you an example. I talked to a lot of different churches, and I would say the churches that have a strict bag policy, when I asked them, walk me through, is there a written policy that actually spells that out? There typically isn't a written policy. It's more of an implied, it's like, Pirates of the Caribbean, they're more guidelines. You know, they're not a written policy. They're not fully formed. It's just kind of more a practice, and that practice could come back to bite you, because what I find is that while they limit for some, they allow others, and all it's going to take is contacting someone and saying, "I'm sorry, you can't bring that backpack in." They look around the corner and they see 20 people walking around with backpacks, and they're going to go, "Why me? Why did you target me?" And that could potentially land you sideways into that you've profiled them unnecessarily. So if you have any questions about forming those policies, or having your policies even evaluated, I would strongly encourage you to get with your insurance provider. Brotherhood Mutual Insurance Company is our church's insurance provider. They've been a great partner. with us. They are fantastic of reviewing these policies and providing best practices, even if you're not a Brotherhood Mutual customer. I would also encourage you, if you have an attorney on staff who understands, probably not a property attorney, but someone who understands this, or your church has an attorney that's available, have them review those policies. You definitely do not want those policies challenged in a court where they haven't been vetted. So that's one of the questions here that came in. They don't have a bag policy. Any recommendations for concrete guidelines? And I would say a lot of it is really working with your insurance provider, what they would recommend, but also the level of risk that your church is willing to accept, and what is the normal for your church. I'll give you as an example. One of our good friend of mine is head of security for an inner city church that really caters to the homeless community. If there was a no backpack policy, that would completely defy any missionality that they had as a church, because everyone walking in has a backpack. If you force those folks to say, no, you have to leave your backpack outside, that's like telling them they have to leave their home unattended. It's just not going to happen. And so I think you need to look at your church. What is normal? What is consistent with your mission as a church? What's the audience you're serving in your community that that you have to now look objectively at these policies, and then just find common sense approaches. But hopefully you're hearing that it's the coupling of the suspicious bag coupled with the suspicious behavior and the location and proximity of where it's left. That's the totality we're referring to. All right. We have another question. If we can fill this real fast, this is kind of a quick story, it looks like. Going through security at Denver Airport a few years ago, and the security person had a very small handheld electronic explosives detector. The man said it was like in a detecting canine, explosive detecting canine. Are those available for church security teams to buy, or are they just too expensive? I'm not familiar with a device like that, Sergeant Ertman. What is that?
They do have those, and unfortunately, based on some of my work I've done in Huntsville, where we do all of our bomb training, I've been stopped and had that thing used on me multiple times. I think I've set off every alarm that that it has on it. They are incredibly expensive. Most police agencies can't even afford one, or if you have a regional team like myself, we don't have anything that is like that. We do have canines, and the canines are awesome for that. So it's they're very good technology. They're available. I don't know if they're available to the public or not. But it is definitely, I would venture to say, there's probably a lot more things that the churches would rather spend that money on than those devices that sometimes are even going to be very sensitive to the point. I mean, think about all of the things that you would need that are around your house that could potentially be in a device or in a bomb that you're going to set it off all the time, and it's going to be for things that are somebody working in the garden,
Yeah.
or working on the farm, or things like that. So it's not necessarily cost effective, in my opinion. But I mean, if your church has got the money and they'll sell you one, I say go for it.
Boy, I don't know many churches that are saying we are flush with cash and we're just not sure what to spend that on. And then, but I think to your point is that there's trained professionals who, and Sergeant Ertman alluded to this, the training that you're getting to gain this webinar, this is very consistent with the type of training presentations that we receive as law enforcement. You're accessing information that is very rich, but also the the requirement or proficiencies that we have to continue to demonstrate. And I can only imagine what Sergeant Ertman's team has to continue to go through to stay on top of what's happening. Definitely, I would recommend staying in your swim lane to be a good reporter, good identifier, good witness. That's probably the best use of time and energy for your teams. A quick question.
Absolutely, and I would say the the observations that you can make, and the physical, what I consider like the physical elements of a situation, are way better indicators of what's going on than just a mere blind chemical sniff. Even with our canines, when they hit on something, we have to have another person, typically a bomb tech, that will be able to assess that whole situation, not just the chemical excuse me, the chemical that made the dog interested.
Gotcha. No, that's true. You're almost kind of corroborating what the dog hit on, things that
Absolutely.
corroborate that. Well, our time is running out. We had one question that was just going back to suspicious behaviors. I would encourage you to listen to the webinar. We covered quite a bit about what are some of the suspicious behaviors that you would see. So I think that question can be answered just through the recording. Another question that came out is, what is a normal size for a small church security team? And that's a real common question I get. And I would say church security teams are should be commensurate with the size of the church and the amount of people that you're managing in worship. Our church is fairly large, and so we have a fairly sizable team, 25 to 30 people that are comprised of our security and medical teams. But I would say most churches that I encounter that have congregations of 100 or so, they may only have 2 or 3. I would highly recommend that you have more than one. It is impossible to be effective in any type of security capacity if you're a team of one, and I would really recommend not even a team of 2. If you're involved in a situation, whether or not you're contacting an individual, you need someone else to be an additional set of eyes, to be the person who's going to potentially call for additional resources, potentially call for 911. And so I would recommend, if you're a small church, at the very least 2 to 3, if would make a big difference. One person is really setting themselves up to fail, in my opinion. Um,
And
and
I would also, if I may weigh in on that,
Sure.
obviously that's not my area of specialty, but this is something that we've talked about before. The training that you go through and the communication that you have and how you're going to handle something if it goes this way. And I think that has even more value than the amount of people. Yes, you need a group of people, but you also need to know what that group of people is going to do in the instance of
You bet.
evacuation or a situation where somebody actually gets physical. And so once you know that and you know what everybody's going to do, there's no question, and it just is, it's the next step in the procedure.
Yeah, 10 people completely untrained is of no value. I'd rather have 3 to 4 people who are trained and know what they're doing, and that's far more effective. Excellent point. Well, we've talked a little bit about different approaches. I want to highly encourage all of our churches that are listening to the webinar here. We have a resource we put together that evaluates a lot of risk assessments, planning, looking at your policies and procedures. If you would like to know more about this comprehensive view of a ministry approach to church safety and security, I would encourage you to go to group.com/security. This was a project we worked on together with Brotherhood Mutual Insurance Company as a partner, and it has video resources, video training for your team and leadership, as well as published resources that help you look at safety and security comprehensively. I would also encourage you, we do trainings around the country. Right now, our fall 2019 schedule is jam-packed, but we're going to be, if you are interested in taking a part in a full-day hands-on training experience with our team, go to group.com/security training and find a location, see if there's one near you. If you're interested in hosting a training, by all means, reach out to us, and if the city is right and there's enough interest in that area, we would be willing to come next spring and host a training in your community. So definitely take a look at those websites. I want to thank Sergeant Ertman for joining us today, and thank you all for carving out an hour of your time to be a part of the webinar. As I promised you, this webinar is being recorded and will be sent to all of the registrants. By all means, share it with anyone who is part of your organizations. If there was a church that you knew of that missed the webinar and you think they would benefit from this content, by all means, share it with them as well. We want this information to get out. We want our churches to be safe. We want them to be good stewards of the congregations that we're called to serve, and we want to be a resource for you. So Sergeant Ertman, thank you for your time and all of your insights and expertise. We sure appreciate it.
It was my pleasure to be here, and I would also like to extend my appreciation and thanking you and everybody listening to for what you do, because you guys are truly the first responders to get to these things even before law enforcement. And we've seen time and time again how much difference somebody who is not wearing a police uniform, how much difference that they make
Mm.
because they were ready to act when something went wrong. So thank you all.
Absolutely. That's a great point. Thanks. I appreciate you saying that. Well, thank you again, everyone. Have a blessed rest of your day, and stay tuned. We're going to be doing more webinars here in the next upcoming months. We have some great content, and so we want to continue to be able to serve you. Take care and God bless.